Good afternoon. My name's Walter Jennings, and I'm CEO of a group called Asia Inside Circle. There might also be some slides. Fantastic. I've been finding it quite interesting to listen to the number of people who are here visiting Hong Kong. Today, Hong Kong it becomes my permanent home. I have qualified today as permanent resident of Hong Kong. Today is the 7th year of living in Hong Kong. So I'm thrilled and I'm glad to have you here. Prior to running Asia Inside Circle, I had been 3 years at Huawei. And at Huawei, I led a function, I led global influencer relations. For those of you who have a high profile in social media, we would invite you to various events at Huawei around the world and get you to share some of your observations and insights with your social network. For those of you on your device right now, I am at Facing China, and so please follow me on Twitter and I'll follow back. I had been coming to China and working out of Hong Kong for quite some time. And in advance of this talk today, I was asked to talk about business success in China. Now, Ann O'Day, who was up earlier, said that I'm a little bit male and pale and not necessarily someone who looks like a China expert. And what I would suggest is the minute you meet someone who says they're a China expert, please run for the door. But what I wanted to do today is to take a couple of scenarios and present them in different ways. So we'll take one situation or one scenario and look at it kind of, I call it chutes and ladders. So how do people generally tend to fail when they're approaching business in China and in Hong Kong? And then how might they use a little bit more understanding to succeed in the same scenario? So it's one person's opinion and my views, and I hope you enjoy. So when you first come to Hong Kong and you first come to China, you feel a sense of energy and excitement. Because it is such a vast country, and it is so, at least for someone who was raised in rural New Jersey, so unusual. And so you feel as part of your background and experience, you need to do things like get your itinerary ready, read the South China Morning Post, spend time here in Hong Kong. Hong Kong, when I first came here in the early 90s, was known as China for beginners. Because this was where you learned in a comfortable environment where you could speak English and perhaps understand the British system, the ways of doing work. And yet today, Hong Kong many times is called the West for beginners, because it's where people who have maybe not from mainland China, have not done business extensively overseas, come to learn about business practices and styles overseas. But whenever you feel you're ready for China, you recognize that the scale of the cultural difference and the challenges are much bigger than you had anticipated. And a lot of that goes back to schooling systems, to background in terms of importance of the individual versus the community. Asia Inside Circle is a network of CEOs, and we meet once a month behind closed doors, and apologies for seeming like the old boys network, but we've got a great diversity of membership. But one of the events that was the most popular that we held recently was the subject was called, Does Happiness Matter? And this was my own personal interest, because I'd been tired of Western parents talking about how all they want is their child to be happy. And it dawned on me that amongst my colleagues in Huawei, no one really ever spoke about happiness. Now that might have been a cultural issue within Huawei itself, it's not known as the happiest company in the world, but that there is culturally more importance placed on harmony than happiness. And the two, while they are very close cousins, they're not related at all. How if you're pursuing happiness, then you're pursuing your own self-interest and you're pursuing what you want and perhaps the needs of the immediate family members. Where if you're pursuing harmony, instead what you're looking for is an ability to interact well with others and cooperate. And when you look at the role of the individual and the society, there's a huge difference between West and East placed on the role of the individual versus the role of the community. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. My very first trip to Beijing was in 1992. And for those of you who are frequent travelers, you will know how much has changed in that city. In fact, the city that I fell in love with no longer exists. It's been new, improved, and changed so dramatically that Beijing has largely architecture from the year 2000 to 2004 in advance of the 2008 games. And all of the old shabby chic that I loved so much of Beijing is long gone. But whatever you think you're prepared for, be prepared for even deeper and greater culture shock. I started talking about the individual. And most of my career I have spent in global public relations agencies working as a consultant paid by the hour for my expertise and background. I'm a specialist in corporate reputation and corporate image. And when I joined Huawei, I thought that I was brought on board for my expertise and my background. In fact, a friend of mine gave me a book called Your First 90 Days and How to Make a Big Impact When You First Join a Company. And at Huawei, they actually talked instead about the first year and how when you're at Huawei, anything that you've done in the first year is really not that important because you're just learning the way Huawei operates. And so there's an expectation that you as an individual won't be able to contribute until you understand the system, the company, the community, the organization, the way teams operate. And so the role of the individual when you're operating in China is still important, but what's more important is the role of the community, the superstructure, the team, the community, the organization. You succeed when the team succeeds, and it's not so much about your individual contribution, but how you're operating within the group and the dynamics of the group and the ability to share with the greatest amount of humility the successes as being group successes. And what happened in the past is if you're coming, say, from New York or even Hong Kong, you're used to going away, getting the problem, getting the brief, going away, solving it, and coming back with this great aha moment. I've got a PowerPoint that's going to slay you because I've come up with a solution. Whereas within the team network and the dynamics when you're working as part of a company within China, it's more about being able to demonstrate those successes as part of a broader team and working together to showcase how you're part of the solution, but it's also the team is it's the successful unit. So it takes time, and I spoke earlier with InspireFest CEO Ann O'Day, who mentioned the importance of being able to see people and meet people and get to know them, relationships, guangxi, being able to understand the individuals that you're working with, and taking the time repeatedly to get to know who you're operating with. when I joined Huawei, quite a lot of people that I knew from other businesses were asking, how do I get a contract? How do I work with Huawei? I've got a great idea. I've got something I want to know. And the challenge became, how could I, in polite terms, tell them that it was unlikely to happen because the company doesn't know you. And the importance of getting to know people over a course of time so they see you as being reliable and trustworthy. I have spent perhaps the majority of my life outside of my home country, and I have lived and worked in France, Canada, Australia, mainland China, Hong Kong. And one of the things I recognize is how deep-seated my own cultural biases are. And one key criteria for success when you're operating outside of your home country is understanding your own cultural biases, whether those come from the education you received, even the style of education. I had been raised in using the Socratic method. Here's a problem, let's discuss it, let's speak about it and explain it ensemble, together. Whereas when I began Mandarin lessons and learning in China, it's all about rote memorization. There are 2,500 characters you have to know by heart. And so there's a greater emphasis on the style of education being different from the style I had been raised with. And you begin to recognize how these small changes add up over a period of time and how they influence the way people work. So when you operate outside of your home country, just be cognizant of your your own barriers and biases. The best advice I gave people when they joined Huawei is not to read things with emotion. Many times when you're communicating cross-culture or cross languages, you have to just read things without emotional impact. So an email that you feel came across really rude and snarky is instead just someone being writing in a language other than their first language, and not necessarily investing emotion into that, but just trying to convey information in a very brief and straightforward fashion. I found that, again, the level of difference very telling that, as an example, in Huawei, there's a great belief that if we struggle and if we are enduring hardship, that makes us better. Ren Zhengfei, the founder of Huawei, has said that employees are like iron ore, that we contain dross that must be burnt off through the hardship and the struggle, and only that way do we become steel. And I put this quote above my desk after I joined Huawei, which he said, the only benefit every Huawei employee is guaranteed is hardship. Now, for those who were speaking earlier about creating a workplace culture that promotes diversity and success, it was really hard to get inspired every day when you know that you are coming in for another serving of dross burning iron ore experience. But again, not my culture, not my home country, and you've just got to be open to the differences and the experience. My absolute favorite piece of advice for anyone is that there are quite a large number of rules and regulations, and China and people in China are very pragmatic. There's a real creativity around working with the rules. Always follow the rules, but don't follow the rules. And it was real shocking when you joined Huawei to find that there were many times where you did something and you were told, well, clearly you've broken the rules. You didn't know that. I mean, it's not that it's published or there's no employee orientation, But instead, people found really creative ways to get around the rules. So if the rules are stone, then you have to be the water. And everyone understands that there's always a workaround, that there's always a way to follow the rules, but not follow the rules, but get what you want done. I had a head of marketing for a global, major company in China who told me that in a democracy, you have a say in making the rule. In China, there's no obligation to abide. The Swedes are always very surprised. And that if you are used to law-abiding, and there are very law-abiding people in China, you assume that then they're going to follow the rules, but the rules are a structure that are at best worked around. And so that may explain sometimes cultural predisposition to finding workarounds, whether that's, I was waiting for the MTR in Shenzhen, and in the main station, one of the main stations, and I suddenly heard this little trio of bells that was announcing the next train coming in. And it was actually the song that is used at the opening of National 9 News in Sydney, Australia. And this was just borrowed because it's like 5 notes, and it's a doo-doo, you know, and you just paid attention. That was lifted or culturally appropriated, but it's kind of the way things work. Within China, when you're working, pay attention to who is the most senior person in the room, because usually the most senior person is the most correct. And you'll notice a change in the work styles when your colleague's boss is in the room, or in the building, because people will work and stay at their desks versus going to lunch. They'll stay until the boss goes. And then if you come into a meeting and the boss has an idea, that is the right answer. Whoever is the most senior is the most right. But at the same time, every one of your colleagues is in the same position. And they try to find the most face-saving way to prove that the boss is correct, but even if their solution doesn't work, that an element of their solution will be used to help them then get the project done. Everyone you'll work with wants to learn. They understand that you bring incredible expertise and perspective, and this is one of the most forward-thinking countries in the world. My family remained in Hong Kong while I worked in Shenzhen, and on Friday nights when I would get back on the Huawei bus to go back towards the train station to head to Hong Kong, I felt like George Jetson getting on the hovercraft that was leaving the future and going backwards in time. Huawei really is bringing the future, and the adoption and the use of technology is unheralded. Time in China is slightly different. You're always working ruthlessly, but also at times it can be very slow to change. It is a culture that is used to being a loner individual in the world, very strong-minded, very stoic, and your time is going to be different. So the time to return on investment, the head of a global agency said double it, quadruple it, and be very clear about what expectations and outcomes you have. And finally, I'd like to ask, is the West is ready for China? I'm apologetic. I am born and remain very proud to be an American. I don't necessarily always agree with the politics of my home country. However, I see rising conflict between China's great ambitions for technology growth, One Belt, One Road, and advancement, and at the same time, not necessarily open arms acceptance of that. Is China ready for the West? I used to think that China was going to, like 30 years ago, people talked about Japan overtaking the world, and yet here we see that, at least in my experience at Huawei, really high levels of hard skills in terms of logistics, supply chain, finance, but a real drought of soft skills, whether that's human resources, career planning, empathy, sales, marketing. So again, I don't necessarily believe there's an answer in terms of is the world ready for China, or is the China ready for the world. I think it's still a maturation process. When I came on stage, I said, anyone who says they're a China expert, please get up and leave. No one really ever can fully grasp the scale and the scope. And I find the more that I personally learn, the less I know. So if you sit here and feel completely unprepared and not ready for China, then you're ready. It's kind of the paradox, the unsolvable solution where no matter how much time you spend and how prepared you feel, you're not going to ever be ready. So I had the impossible request of trying to explain how to succeed in business in China in 15 minutes. I've taken an approach to present situations and different solutions. I hope I've given you enough to begin your thinking about China, and I appreciate your time and interest today. Thank you very much.